Welcome everyone to the second conversation of the 9th series of conversations. For this one, there are occasions when a speaker should start by making what in Parliament might be called a personal declaration, which is this: that Tom Arnold has been a friend for many decades, and for a long part of the time when I lived in a priory in Dublin, we were neighbours, only I think 3 roads away. So we were within walking distance, easy walking distance. You all probably know Tom from his having been chairman of Concern Worldwide. But before that, he had a very distinguished public service career. Growing up farming in North County Dublin, took his UCD degree in agricultural economics, and then did 2 further and higher degrees in Louvain and in Trinity. Started work in the European Commission, returned to Ireland and eventually becoming Assistant Secretary and Chief Economist in the Department of Agriculture. All of his work has been involved with agriculture and the development of food systems. Since retiring, he hasn't been lazy. He was engaged by Kofi Annan to be a member of a UN working group on food security. He chairs a European working group on the same topic, and he is the Irish government's special envoy on food systems. In partnership with a man called Steve Collins from Valid International, he reorganised the way in which food is distributed in famine districts. Instead of making the people come to a centre, the food is brought to them. And that reorganisation, it's called community therapeutic care, greatly reduced mortality rates and made food distribution much more efficient. So, when you know of his involvement in policy making, and when you know of his experience in delivering food in famine-afflicted areas, I'm sure you will agree that Tom Arnold is the perfect man to discuss with us the question, will the world run out of food? Tom Arnold.
Bernard, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here for this part of the Ennismore Conversations, which I understand is in its 9th year, which is a great tribute to the concept. One of the benefits of being near neighbours for a number of years in Dublin was that we would occasionally have a little nightcap together to discuss the various small and big issues of the world. So when Bernard asked me to address this question, will the world run out of food, I thought I'd try and take a longer term perspective and put it in that longer term perspective to tell the story of population and food over the 250 years, from 1800 to 2050. And I thought I'd try and tell the story through the lives and ideas of 5 people. And they're up there on the screen, and I'll talk about them along the way in telling this story. Thomas Malthus, who was a demographer and economist around the turn of the... he lived in that period, 1766 to 1834, very influential at the time, and indeed his ideas still keep a certain resonance. Mao Zedong, you're all familiar with. I'll be talking about him in the context of famine. Norman Borlaug is one of the great figures of the last century in that he was a plant breeder behind what's called the Green Revolution. Amartya Sen, who's still alive, a very prolific writer, an economist, who helped to explain how famines occurred and the dynamics of famine. And then Gordon Conway, who equally happily is still alive, and a British ecologist, who's looking to the future, and his writings, I think, very influential. So they're the people that we encounter as I tell this story of what happened over this 250-year period. And also, what will also be evident is that you can't talk about food and population without politics becoming deeply part of that conversation. So that's part of what we'll be discussing as we proceed. I want to start by talking about Thomas Malthus. As I said, an English economist and demographer, at a period when in England, the end of the 18th century, the population was growing at a historically unprecedented rate. And that was giving rise to concerns about the balance between population and food. And Malthus produced a famous essay in 1789, the year of the French Revolution, called An Essay on the Principle of Population. And his thesis was that population would always outrun the growth in food production, and that only war, famine, or moral restraint, abstinence, can check the growth in population. He saw famine as inevitable and as, quote, the most dreadful resource of nature. Now, apart from that theory, he was also able to refer to history to back up his argument, because the world was familiar with famine over millennia at that stage. And if anyone wants to go into this in more detail, one of the great Irish economic historians, Cormac O'Grada, has written a book called Famine, A Short History, which was published in 2009. And of course, Cormac was also probably the preeminent historian of our own great famine. But drawing briefly on some of those, on that book by Cormac, Famine, A Short History, I just quote a few very selected phrases and sentences. It says, the earliest recorded famines, all associated with prolonged drought, date from the 3rd millennium BC in Egypt. Most of the worst famines on record have been linked to too much or too little rain. The Great European Famine, 1315, 1317, was the product of torrential rain and low temperatures during the summer of 1315. The Great Frost of 1740 led to Blean on Air, the year of carnage, and in mid-January 1740, one could walk across Ireland's largest lake for miles. Cold winter. Of course, we all probably are somewhat familiar with our own history of famine in Ireland from the 1845 to 1847. A famine which was very much unspoken about for well over a century. There was a deep reticence about talking about it. And that begun to be broken with Cecil Woodham Smith's really important book published in 1962 called The Great Hunger. But the 20th century then has had another series of famines, really big famines, among the most notable of which are in the Soviet Union, just after the beginning of the Soviet Union, 1921-22, another really important one, 1932-33, and that was really about Ukraine, in Ukraine, and part of policy by Stalin at that stage. And then, obviously, the probably the biggest famine of the 20th century, the Chinese famine, 1959 to 1961, hence Mao's presence on this list, and I'll speak a little bit more about him later. But within our own lifetime, the famines we can perhaps easily remember. Biafra in the late 1960s, what was called the first famine on television. It gave rise to the creation of Africa Concern and organisations like Médecins Sans Frontières. The famine in Ethiopia, 72-73. Famine in Bangladesh, 74-75, in the wake of the creation of Bangladesh. The famine in Cambodia, 75-79, the period of Pol Pot and his tyrannical rule. The other famine, of course, in the 1980s, which we can all of us probably easily remember, in 84-85, that gave rise to Live Aid and Bob Geldof. Early 90s in Somalia, 91-92, we remember from Mary Robinson as president going and witnessing it and giving voice to the need to do something about it. The famine in North Korea, 1995 to 98. But all of that long history, perhaps to be summarised in two quotations that I want to read. One from Cormac O'Grody's book, to say that it is a great irony that the most deadly famines of the last century, including the worst ever in terms of sheer numbers, occurred under regimes committed, at least on paper, to the eradication of poverty. The history of the USSR, 1917 to 89, is pockmarked by famine. Post-1949, China's remarkable record of achievements in terms of life expectancy will always be marred by the Great Leap Forward famine in 1959 to 61, resulting in the deaths of millions of people. There's a debate about how many millions, but it's probably 25 to 30 million people. And he also refers to the famine in North Korea. So that's why Mao is up there. Despite all his achievements and China's achievements, one of history's great monsters. Another more up-to-date quotation comes from another really important writer on famine called Alex Duval, and he published a book in 2018, just 4 years ago, entitled Mass Starvation, The History and Future of Famine. And this is how he starts this book. Something remarkable happened over the past 30 years. The risk of dying in famine has become much, much smaller than at any time in human history. Calamitous famines that kill 1 million people or more have vanished. Famines that kill over 100,000 people still occur, but they are rarer and less lethal. At least 150 million people died in great and calamitous famines in the 140 years from 1870 to 2010, and almost all of them died before 1980. Now, what's the explanation for this big, big change? Well, it is really that in the last 30 years, the world has put in place a whole infrastructure to deal with this problem. First of all, to prevent it from happening. There's a whole series of early warning systems in place now so that situations that are deteriorating are picked up early. And then on top of that, of course, there's a big infrastructure in terms of capability to deal with problems that do occur. A combination of the World Food Programme in particular, that's the world safety net for dealing with problems like this, and the NGOs working together, or the big NGOs working together. And all of that has been put in place really predominantly over the last 40 years, but more intensively over the last 30 years. The other reason why this has changed is because indeed of understanding about the dynamics of famine. And this brings us to Amartya Sen, the great economist who won the Nobel Prize in 1988. I see today's today the Nobel Prize for Economics has also been announced, but Sen, one of the most important economists in terms of his work giving rise to really practical consequences, and his two important books on this area, he's written many books. One was called Poverty and Famines, written in 1981, and the second one, Development as Freedom, is Development as Freedom in 1999. And Sen's work, as one commentator said, refocused famine studies, changing it from a Malthusianism perspective towards a distributionist perspective. And what we mean by that really is that a famine, according to Sen, is caused by a failure, or saying that a famine caused by a failure or just a serious shortfall in the harvest would lead to a devaluation of all non-food possessions. So the poorest people lose their purchasing power to ensure their own survival. And that's evident it's evident in the last 10 years ago when a big famine occurred in Somalia, and it looks like to be replicating itself today, where the really danger signs are where cattle are dying because of drought, and that means that people have no income, and that means they're vulnerable to famine. So Sen's key insight was that the principal cause of famine is not the availability of food, but access to food. Now, on the face of it, that seems such a blindingly straightforward conclusion to reach. But Sen was the one who reached it and who gave all the evidence to support that conclusion over his analysis of famine over many decades. The second key insight that Sen brought to this discussion was that democracy, or civil and political rights and press freedom, offer practical protection from famine. And that again, it seems very obvious, because if you're in a society where there is the beginning signs of a famine and public opinion can be brought to bear, pressure can be brought to bear on authorities to do something about it, that's going to be a really important factor. And that was one of the great examples of that, of course, was the famine in Ethiopia in the mid-80s, when you had a very bad government, a very tyrannical government run by the then Parliament, the Derg, and they just didn't want to admit the possibility that there was famine in that country, and that's why the response was so late, and that's why so many people died. So that's what I want to say about famine, the evolving thinking about famine, and it goes back, of course, to Malthus's view that famine was going to be the key limiting factor in population growth in the world. But that's not, of course, what happened. And I now want to go on and talk about what has happened to global population since Malthus promulgated his theory in 1798. And the demography of this is very interesting. And just looking at how world population has changed over the millennia, but particularly since 1800. These are some of the statistics. Year 1, let's call it 1 AD, according to one study I read, the world population was 188 million. By the year 1000, it had gone up to 295 million. By 1800, it reached about 1 billion people in the world. By 1900, it was 1.7 billion. By 1950, 2.5 billion. By 2000, 6.1 billion. And by 2050, expected to be 9.7 billion. Now, they're just statistics. But let's just look at let's discuss them in a slightly different way. Between 1800 at 1 billion to get to 2 billion took 120 years. So the world in 1920 had 2 billion people. It took another 40 years to get to 3 billion. But then things speeded up. 4 billion was reached in an additional 14 years, 1974. 5 billion was reached in another 13 years, 1987. 6 billion was reached in another 12 years, 1999. 7 billion in another 12 years, 2011. And now we're beginning to see the signs of this population slowdown. 8 billion reached in 2022, should be reached in about 2025, in a couple of years' time, and 9 billion by 2045, so that's taking 20 years. So what it means is that the growth rate in all regions is slowing. The peak growth in population in the world occurred about 1965, when world population was growing at about 2% per annum. By 2010, it was down to 1%, and by 2020, it was expected to be down to 0.5%. So what's happening here is something called the demographic transition. And the demographic transition is about really moving from a society, you're right, Bernard? A society with a high death rate and high birth rate to moving to a society with much lower death rate and much lower birth rate. Now that process of demographic transition in Europe started in the middle of the 19th century. And until then, you had years of high death rates, with the consequences of epidemic diseases or failed harvests or famine, or a combination of both. But during that century, due to better hygiene, improvements in public health, better transport, crisis mortality became less frequent. And later then, in the 19th century, child survival rates began to improve. And for example, the vaccination against smallpox led to its eradication with the last European smallpox pandemic in 1871. That contributed, all of that, to a reduction in death rate from an average of 30 deaths per thousand population in the beginning of the 19th century to about 15 per thousand at the beginning of the 20th century. But over that same period, birth rates remained about the same, about 30 to 35 births per thousand of population. But as the 20th century moved on, birth rates in Europe fell. So you then had a new balance, if you like, between death rates and lower population, death rates and lower birth rates. But where the big explosion in population came was in the second half of the 20th century in developing countries. And that was due to the fact that the process of demographic transition occurred at a more extreme rate and on a larger scale and more quickly than had occurred in Europe. And this, of course, then in the whole post-war period, this was happening, and then the issue of total fertility, the average number of women per child, average number of children per woman was much higher in these countries than in Europe, but then it began to decline very quickly. So you had a combination of rapidly falling death rates and rapidly declining birth rates, and that's what gave rise to the explosion in population that we've seen from about the mid 20th century onwards. It's very important to recognise the strong connection between child mortality and fertility. In countries with high levels of child mortality, fertility is high, and vice versa. And of crucial importance to recognise that the decline in child mortality always precedes the decline in fertility. This is very understandable, because if the expectation is that there will be significant child mortality, families are going to have larger numbers of children. But when that moment comes where they can depend that child mortality is lower, then inevitably will come the trend towards smaller families. So that's the story, if you like, again following on from Thomas Malthus, the story of population and its evolution, having put famine to one side in telling that story. So where the other part of the story, of course, is about food production. And Malthus' starting belief that food production could only grow at a certain limited rate. And of course that was disproven in the course of the 19th century with agricultural revolutions, better husbandry, etc., during in much of Europe. And indeed, towards the later half of the 19th century, you had protectionist policies for farmers, with farmers playing an important political role. They managed to get in place protectionist policies as early as the late 19th century, which was really the forerunner of the Common Agricultural Policy in the late 1950s when it came along. But I want to skip though to the fact that as far as in the 1960s, there was still real concern about food. There was still, if you like, there was a newer version of Malthusianism then, in that, in particular in the Indian subcontinent, there was a great fear of huge food shortages. And in the mid-1960s, India was very largely dependent on American food aid. 1996 and 97, America shipped a fifth of its wheat production in food aid to India. In 1968, an American scientist called Paul Ehrlich wrote a book called The Population Bomb. And in this he said, hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. So that was the background against which action had to be taken, and action came in the shape of the Green Revolution, and the person who's known as the father of the Green Revolution, Norman Borlaug, a plant breeder, an American plant breeder, who started work in the mid-1940s in Mexico on a program funded by the Rockefeller Foundation on trying to develop new strains of crops, particularly wheat, to breed new strains of new varieties of wheat, which were semi-dwarf, so shorter strawed wheat, high yielding, disease resistant, and which were capable of being grown with higher levels of fertilizer. And in the past, if you put it on some of the more traditional varieties, if you got their yields up, they were prone to lodging because the straw couldn't support the heavier grain. But these new short-stemmed varieties of wheat managed to overcome that. So from about through the late 40s into the 50s, Borlaug was pioneering these new varieties. And so Mexico became indeed an exporter of wheat by 1963. And in the early 60s, you began to have a collaboration between Borlaug's team in Mexico and the Indian Agricultural Research Institute in India, led by a man called Swaminathan. His daughter works for the WHO, and she was frequently on the TV during the COVID crisis. And they really achieved a revolution in terms of of spreading these new varieties, particularly in India and in Pakistan, and indeed across all of Asia. And this was really part not just of a great humanitarian effort to provide food, it was part of a much bigger geopolitical issue, because the war in Vietnam was going on at the time. There was a lot of great sensitivity about it. And there's an extremely interesting book called The Hungry World, America's Cold War Battle Against Poverty in Asia, which which deals with all of this. But anyway, this really changed the tide of history, this achievement of the Green Revolution. Norman Borlaug was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for his contribution, and a bit somewhat later in 1986 he was instrumental in setting up the World Food Prize, which is kind of the Nobel Prize for food, and that is running up to now. So that was a turning point moment in the early 70s when, you know, the fear of major hunger, major disaster, particularly in India, was banished for the moment, and India turned around and was able to become an exporter of wheat rather than a food aid importer. And this was again a moment where the politics of food came into play. There was a World Food Summit held in 1974 where people, you know, recognizing that they had to keep a focus on food and keep it important. There had been established in 1971 something called the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research. This was a grouping of 15 international agricultural research centres that were at the forefront of really trying to deal with different aspects of research into food, very much based on the work that Borlaug had done in Mexico and had been done in the Philippines on rice. And that from then on, if you like, from the early 1970s, what you actually saw was a world in which the supply of food somewhat exceeded the demand for food over about a 40-year period. And that was reflected in falling prices, falling food prices over a very long period. The FAO produced what's called the Food Price Index, which puts together the price of all the major commodities. And it would show that from 1960 to 2020, a 60-year period, for most of that, real food prices adjusted for inflation, were falling on a year-to-year basis, except for a few spikes along the way. And those spikes were in the early 70s, and there was another spike then in 2007, 2008, when a combination of food, sort of demand and supply factors came into play. There was rapid increases in the prices of the major commodities that led to food riots in over 30 or 40 countries. And suddenly food was back on, having been taken for granted by political leaders, was back up the political agenda again. So that's what, if you like, that's what has been happening when we look to the more recent times. Again, there's been a realization that the issue of food, and when we talk about malnutrition, it's a more complex problem than we were used to talking about it in. When most of us were talking about malnutrition for up at least until 2010, what we really meant was undernutrition. People without an adequate supply of food. But the more correct definition of malnutrition takes into account two other forms of malnutrition. Micronutrient deficiencies, which what's called hidden hunger, which means that people are not getting the right type of food and leaves themselves open to different forms of diseases. And increasingly, and this becomes a bigger problem in every country in the world, an increase in overweight and obesity. So that's now what is recognized as malnutrition in its three dimensions. And that is something that has to now be dealt with in a much more serious way. But in the more, that's part of the reason why we've begun to talk about what's called sustainable food systems. A food system that actually tries to minimize the number of people who are hungry, but also faces up to the other two dimensions of malnutrition, micronutrient deficiencies and overweight and obesity. Now I'm coming towards the end because I just want to bring it into the last decade in particular, when, again, this debate has become more complex. 2015 is an important year because we have there two important international agreements. One, the agreement of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and the second one, the Paris Climate Agreement. A recognition that we have to actually attain a slowing down in the rate of global warming. And the connection between the two of those agreements actually is connected to food, because there's a recognition that if the climate agreement is to be reached, having sustainable food systems is a very important part of that. There's obviously a connection between food and climate. The food system is generating emissions which are adding to the global warming, so they have to be reduced. But on the other hand, the climate change is impacting our food production. It's becoming, with shorter growing seasons, with more extreme weather events, that has had a big impact. So, pulling these two things together, in 2019, the UN Secretary General decided to call what's called a Food System Summit, which happened last year in September of 2021, to see could the two sectors work together in a more substantial and convincing way. And I'm glad that Ireland played a very important role in that summit, and it also then played an important role in a subsequent international meeting called Nutrition for Growth, which happened in Tokyo in December. So we've got up to this moment, and we've had two other events that need to be mentioned. One is COVID. I mean, the COVID brought home to people how, if you like, vulnerable we were on the food systems. I mean, we began to realize that long supply chains left us vulnerable as a world community, and that we had to think in terms of having food systems that were more resilient and could cope with shocks. But the other thing, of course, that has arrived is this year's crisis in Ukraine. And that has brought home to everybody, again, just the vulnerability of the world food systems, not just food but energy as well, to create the food, to produce the food. We also, probably few of us realized before the Ukraine crisis, the degree to which parts of the world were dependent on imports from that part of the world, from Ukraine and Russia. Because when you look at areas, particularly in North Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, many of those countries were dependent for their food imports, up to some of them 80 to 90% on food coming from Ukraine and Russia. So that's going to give rise to two consequences. One is that these countries are going to work towards, in the longer term, diversify their imports. And secondly, they're going to work towards producing more of their own food themselves. So they are sort of important changes that I think are going to happen over the next decade. And of course, we none of us know how the crisis in Ukraine is going to, what is going to be involved in its resolution. So looking to the next 30 years, up to 2050, in a world which won't be far short of 10 billion people, I want to suggest there are three key areas where we should be looking to invest in. And this is where I offer you my friend Gordon Conway. 20 years ago, Gordon wrote a book called The Doubly Green Revolution. And that was really saying that we need a second green revolution, but it can't be the same as the first green revolution, which depended as much as it did on intensification of agriculture, on heavy use of fertilizers. It needs to be a green revolution which is based on more sustainable production systems. And this is a deeply important insight, and it's one that I think has to now to be followed. But the three areas, and this I think connects back to some of the other things I've been saying throughout this talk, the three areas where there needs to be serious investment is one in people, secondly in democracy, and thirdly in science. The people one, there's two particular areas which have to get particular attention. The first one is investment in early childhood nutrition. The last 15 years has seen a deep insight into the critical importance of nutrition in what they call the first 1,000 days, during pregnancy and up to 2 years. And if children are not properly nourished at that period, those critical period of 1,000 days, they run the risk of what's called stunting of both their body and their brain. And many countries, particularly in Africa, have existing stunting rates of between 30 to 50%. And this is a critical impediment to those countries' later development. So that's one area. And the second area, of course, is in education and empowerment of girls and women. Because if we look at the countries that still have very high birth rates, they're the poorest countries. They're part and parcel of what their lives are like is very high levels of early marriage. So focus on education of girls, make sure will contribute to not only keeping them in school, but also reducing early marriage. So that issue of investment in people is of really critical importance. The second area in a world which has moved towards autocracy in more recent times in many countries, but the second area is investment in democracy. The insights of Amartya Sen, that if you are to have any chance of better nutrition, certainly avoidance of famine, you need to have more democratic societies. And the third area is in the area of science. There's still huge capacity, I think, to produce more food. I think the challenge that Bernard posed me, will we run out of food? I think the answer is no. Well, I'm certain it's no. But it's not no for certain countries. For certain vulnerable countries, there is a serious risk, and particularly those countries at greatest risk of climate change. That's the big uncertainty for the next 30 years. Where is climate change going to go? And we've seen this year major droughts in Europe and across the world. If that was to continue, if that pattern was to continue, then the whole risk of having viable food systems at global level becomes much more problematic. Just to conclude then, just to say where Ireland is in all of this. Well, I'm happy to say I think we're in a reasonably good place in that we have committed ourselves through our own domestic policy on food to work towards being not only being sustainable, having sustainable food systems at home, but that we want to promote that idea of sustainable food systems through our foreign policy as well. And that I think is a positive place to be. It's in our own interests in terms of a food exporter to do that, but I think it's very much also in the interest of the wider world that we can take that position and that we can deliver. So I hope you found that the 5 people there, they're all men of course. If I was to do the same thing and just try to tell a similar story with women. It would probably be a harder job to find them, but I'm sure it can be done, it could be done. But that, I'm afraid, is for another night. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom, for giving us such. Thank you, Tom, for giving us such a clear picture of the complexities of working out our responsibility for feeding the world, the scientific, the farming, the political, and the philosophical complexities at play. We call these events conversations. So I propose that we break for 10 minutes so that people can talk among yourselves, or if anybody wants to go up and down or out into the fresh air, and that we will gather back here and continue a conversation where I'm sure people have their own insights and comments to offer, and they might even draw further information out of Tom. When we kind of tiptoed around and was doing a bit of eavesdropping, there were all kinds of interesting and flexible ideas being shared 1-to-1 or sometimes 2-to-3. So here's now an opportunity to share with the larger groups insights, questions, comments. Connor. So, does anyone want to begin with a comment on what they heard, something that, or what it may have prompted in your thinking?
I'd like to know what Tom would think of GM, you know, that's one area where science and food, you know, you'd be worried about the direction that it's taken. And the other area, I suppose, is the wider thing, like, you know, how normal food things, like you were saying about the importance of a child being nursed, it is the benefit immensely as a result of the normal process being followed, rather than going quickly onto kind of child food, canned stuff, you know.
Yes.
No, they're not the same thing, I suppose, but I'd like to know your thinking on that. I mean, maybe it's not a question and answer time, but maybe.
No, I think they're both very relevant questions, and I was just saying to Dell there on the GM front. I mean, GM's got genetically modified organisms, or GMO food, has got a pretty bad reputation in many circles, and of course there's quite a lot of big restrictions on it in Europe. Now, I think this is going to have to change, and there's a new technique called gene editing, which means that there can be particular genes inserted into a plant or into an animal to deal with a particular characteristic. I mean, for the most part, we don't have any problem with GM technology in our medicines. You know, a lot of these things, say insulin, for example, is dominated by this. So I think as we move towards a much more challenging climate crisis over the next 30 years, we're going to have to be a lot more nimble in terms of some of the breeding processes that we have for both our plants and animals. And I think this is going to become a much bigger issue. And I think we're going to have to be open to accepting that the science of genomics gives us possibilities that we haven't had up to now, and we're going to have to adapt and use those extra possibilities. In terms of the, what I was talking about, this first 1,000 days, I mean, this is really focusing on just trying to ensure that the child gets proper nourishment. And the key thing is that actually the best nourishment is the mother. The best is breastfeeding. So the business of baby foods really shouldn't come into play at all until the child is established. Now, that's more theoretical. It doesn't always happen, but that's what we should be striving for. But the main thing is that there is a real acknowledgement that health systems, support from others, has to be really focused on that early childhood period. And it really does go back to pregnancy. I mean, the need to make sure that pregnant women are properly nourished is actually the key starting point. And after that, that the child is properly nourished in that up to 24 months. And that really is only in the last, I would say, 15 years that recognition came through as clearly as it's now fully established. There's no debate about it. But getting it done, of course, in many countries, in poorer countries, is not the same thing. So the two issues are entirely pertinent.
Is it a little parallel to what they say about education, that the first years in the education system are formative?
I'm sure that's right.
Yeah.
But I mean, the other point that I made about particularly the education of girls is of absolute central importance, not just for their own personal development, but ultimately for, there's too many girls getting pregnant and becoming mothers too young.
Yeah.
And there's a whole cycle then enters into play. Children are born underweight. Women's life possibilities are different and more restricted. So that whole area of both education and empowerment is of crucial importance. I mean, it's to be interesting to see how this situation in Iran plays out, because here you have maybe a generation of young women saying, enough is enough. I mean, the counterpart of seeing these old fellows with beards, laying down the law, and all these young people saying, this isn't of any relevance to us. I mean, let's hope it can achieve a happy outcome.
I find myself with lots of questions. Now, I declare an interest from the time I left school until I was 70. I milked cows.
Yes.
That's what I made my living doing.
Yes.
So I suppose the whole climate change thing is, very much in my thoughts.
Yes.
And finding the way forward. Now, you may say the way forward is blindingly obvious. Generally speaking, yes, but working out the detail of that isn't quite so handy.
Yes.
Like, for example, it seems to me that one of the things that farmers should be doing is bulking up the carbon in the soil,
Yeah.
the soil health.
Yeah.
And, like, there are equal measures that are coming into play next year. That really isn't taken into account there, So I suppose, look, more rational thought about it. Like, listening to the radio, television and all the rest of it, there's a lot of confrontation. That's not very helpful. Finding the way forward. Like, you talked about science being one of the things. Like, knowledge maybe is another way of putting that.
Yeah.
So just to know the way forward. I suppose another thing that is very much my thoughts, like, I found dairy farming tough work, but very rewarding, and emotionally rewarding. And I suppose I find it very hard to get it out of my head that was a good thing to be doing. Like the animal, like every time you turn on the television, you hear somebody advocating plant-based this, plant-based that, and that gets my goal. You know? Now, is it my prejudice or is it my instincts that are talking there? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Again, like the last comment, these are very relevant things. On the first issue of soil health,
Yes.
I think there's really increasing recognition that investing in our soil health has to become much greater priority than it has been up to now, and the role of soil in capturing carbon and being reflected, there being incentives to do that. That again it's moving in that direction, but it's not probably moving fast enough. The current strategy we have as a country is called Food Vision 2030, and I chaired that process, which is now in place. There's a big meeting on Thursday in Dublin Castle, which we're kind of doing an early stock take of that, and Taoiseach will be speaking at it. But there, some of the things that are in that strategy, I think, are actually in the right, moving in the right direction. And the emphasis on soil health and the emphasis on ensuring that dairy farming has to become more sustainable as well.
Sure.
Now, I mean, it's very sustainable economically at the moment. I mean, there hasn't been a time where dairy farming has been, I mean, it's doing very well.
This is a good year.
It's a good year. But there is pressure on to, in a couple of areas where there has to be more progress made. And one is tackling the emissions crisis problem, the 25% target for by 2030. I mean, I think that can be largely done, but there needs to be more science put in towards it. The other area, though, which is really, really serious and which has to be dealt with very seriously, is the whole question of water quality. And again, I think we're moving in the right direction. I think some of the big co-ops now are linking, and they will be from 2024 onwards, paying the price of milk linked to practices on farms, sustainability. All of that, I think, is in the right direction. The whole debate about, I think there's a completely unnecessary level of division in this debate between agriculturalists and environmentalists. And I've been advocating for a long time this should be toned down. We should be agreeing an agenda to work, a common agenda to work towards, and then work on that agenda. But there's the other issue about when you talk about all the talk about plant-based foods getting on your goat. You know, there was a conference here held in Dublin last Monday, which I was speaking, run between the department and the FAO, about the whole area of livestock and its role in farming. Not just in Ireland, but globally. And there's two things to say here. One is that livestock is a key part of farming systems in most countries in the world. And there are many parts of the world where in order for this land to be properly used, livestock has to be a key element of that. And the second thing is that the whole role of animal protein in diet is of crucial importance. Like, it can legitimately be said that in much of the developed, rich world, people eat probably too much meat.
True.
But for the rest of the world, and that's the majority of the world, most people are not getting sufficient animal protein. And so that basic point has to be maintained, and Ireland needs to keep making this point internationally in particular. So, I mean, I'm completely on your side.
Thank you.
in your prejudices.
Okay.
Do you know if the seeds that are being saved, are they genetically modified? The seeds that the scientists have saved in the cold north, I forget exactly the country where it is, and I know they've saved seeds for the future.
Yeah, there's a couple of seed banks. There's a number of really important seed banks, and this is part of the role of this, what I call the CG system, which was established in 1971 and which continues to, I would say, flourish. It still has 15 of these centres dotted all around the world. There's been a number of important Irish contributions made in terms of people we were talking earlier about a couple of the Irish people who've made big contributions to the CG system, who are all of them, mainly from Cork, Michael Walsh and Tony Walsh in their day. So these seed banks are really important. But what I was going to say was that the CG system has recently gone through a whole rethink of what its priorities are, and it's something they've come up with a policy called the One CG system, and it's really trying to make sure that their current research programs are adjusted, are focused on the real problems that now exist, and that particularly brings into account the whole way in which the agri-food systems adjust to climate change. Because climate change is becoming just so significant, particularly in Africa. And so we're going to need new farming systems, new seeds, new animal production systems, etc. Does that answer the question?
Are they genetically modified?
Well,
Obviously.
most of them are not. Most of them are sort of normal seeds. They're not genetically modified. But I do think we're going to have to become more open to this concept of genetic modification and gene editing, because we're going to have to find ways of adapting our crops and our animals to the new circumstances. So I think I wouldn't be in favour of all the time saying, well, we can't move towards some level of acceptance of the science of genomics, which has opened up huge new change possibilities over the last 15 years.
Thank you.
Can I go back to the when you mentioned about the two of the problems of obesity and micronutrient deficiency?
Yeah.
And I suppose the first part of my question is, is there any? Would you have any kind of comments on how to? Yeah, I mean, it's such a large kind of complex problem, but the tackling the obesity problem in the world, and then also, do you think that there is kind of an interrelationship between obesity and micronutrient deficiency, in that if you're, let's say, if you can in some way make some progress in obesity, will that improve micronutrient deficiency, or are they separate? Are they separate?
No, I think they're linked.
Yeah.
I just think that there needs to be a recognition that this is a growing problem in every country in the world. And the consequences are, if it keeps going in the direction it's going, there's huge public health implications, and there's huge cost implications coming down the tracks. Diabetes, heart disease, etc. So it's actually in all our society's interest to begin to, the old story, prevention is better than cure, a stitch in time saves 9. So we really should be putting more emphasis on this. And again, in our strategy, we made recommendations in the Food Vision 2030 that there needs to be a lot more joined up thinking. For example, between the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Health. Now that's not happening up to now. Partly, of course, in the short term because of COVID. But in most countries in the world, these two sets of departments don't talk to each other.
Isn't it true that vegetables now would have far less micronutrients? Isn't it true that vegetables now, let's say kale, would has something like 70% less magnesium than it would have had 30 years ago due to overproduction?
Soil depletion, probably.
Soil depletion. So, let's say I buy kale in the supermarket now, it would have far less magnesium.
Yeah.
And the World Health Organization has a acknowledged or says that about 85% of us or something are short of magnesium, which is needed for about 300 body functions.
Yeah.
So that's a micronutrient that was widely much more available to our parents, our grandparents, than it is to us, and has huge implications for heart because it's a muscle, and so that's what, and as you say, joined up thinking is really essential, and it doesn't seem to be happening.
Yeah, not enough of it anyway.
No.
And the other thing is that there's a lot of evidence suggesting that part of the consequences of climate change will actually be expressed in the nutrient quality of certain foods. So they're the sorts of things that we're going to have to pay more attention to. I mean, apart from say the intensive chemical fertilizer intensity of the Green Revolution, that's one criticism of it. But the other was that all it was doing was increasing the quantity of food, the calories of food, whereas it wasn't looking at the quality of food. So they're the sorts of things that I think a lot more attention is going to have to be paid to.
And like what you said about the obesity, you can crave food because you're looking for a nutrient, and they are very linked, it would appear to.
The whole quality of calories that we're consuming. So, I mean, it's perfectly, I think, legitimate, absolutely, to say a healthier diet probably involves more plant-based for, let's say, this community. But, as I said, in many of the poorer countries, actually a better diet means more animal protein.
Is there any evidence in government type circles, especially in the States, has anybody come out and said like that the Americans were dying like flies due to COVID because they were all obese, they were all overweight, they had I know, but what I'm asking are their bodies, is it the US Department of Agriculture, the food industry in the States, the government in the States, whoever runs the whole show in the States, is there people waking up to this, like that this is really bad, like these people are just dying, and the Africans aren't dying, and the Americans are dying, and it's down to overeating protein and fat and the whole thing is how to kill them. But is there anything in the air to say people are going to start and say we better sort this out quick?
Yeah. Well, first of all, as an introduction to my answer, I suppose all I would say is that any of us who have the chance to go to the United States and just look with your own eyes, you see the scale of the problem.
Literally.
Yeah, and also you see, even in simple things like the size of the portions that you're presented with in any. But is there an awareness? I think the answer is yes. There was on the 28th of September, which was 2 weeks ago, there was a White House conference on food, hunger and health. And this was the last time there was a White House conference was in 1969 under President Nixon. And the focus at that stage was on actually hunger, undernutrition in the United States. Some of that came from a visit that Bobby Kennedy had made to Mississippi in 1967 and had come back horrified. That led to this White House conference in 1969, which had really big consequences in terms of food support arrangements for poorer people at that stage, which continue to this day. But the reason this White House conference was held was a growing recognition of the problems of obesity. And there's a whole series of positive things came out of that. Now, how they were reacted upon is another day's work. But it is, at least it happened. And if you want to go into and Google it, you'll see, I think, a lot of positive things that came out of it. The question now is, it can be, how is it to be followed through on? Now, I think we in Ireland should be looking at that and saying, look, I mean, okay, the problem in the States is of a different order, I think, than
Oh yeah,
have here.
we're following, like.
But that's the direction
Yeah.
we should be anticipating we should be going.
Yeah, there's some very interesting, really old film clips of Cork in 1904, 1906. You see people walking the streets of Cork in 1904. They're also slim looking compared to even now, and we're not overweight compared to the people in the States, but we're overweight compared to the Cork people of 1904. All slim and svelte and moving quickly
Well, yeah.
and hungry. And hungry maybe, yeah. Looking for the next meal. Yeah.
It seems to me that listening to you talk about the Department of Health should be in closer communication, say, with the Department of Health. That all sounds right. But underneath all of that, and above all of that, are vested interests in the world. I have no idea how one can come to terms with them, whether it's the fossil fuel industry or Big Mac and burgers and all those farmers in America that produce just that kind of potato for chips or just that kind of beef for burgers. Would you like to comment about?
Well, you know, there are two ways of dealing with this. One is actually working with the sectors to say, can we agree on certain improvements? And that has been reasonably successful up to now. I mean, there's, for example, there's been agreement with many of these food sectors to say reduce salt levels in food, and some other examples of that. So I think that can be taken a certain distance, and that's the easier way to go. But there's a certain moment where I think the state has to take responsibility for regulation, and to be prepared maybe to say, look, we are actually insisting on certain standards. And that's a debate that I think needs to take place at certain moments. We haven't got there yet, I think so.
No, and currently, in the UK, the current government is back on some legislation it was to bring in about obesity, about these 3 offers, buy whatever it is, buy one, get one free.
Yeah.
About the amount of sweet stuff kids are eating and the sugar in various products. They're rowing back on that. They're rowing back on, on their green credentials after COP26. And yet, at the end of your talk this evening, which was fascinating, democracy came in the middle of your 3 things at the end. And I'm not sure, but we've got a democratic government over there, supposedly, as they have in Russia. I mean, where is this democracy?
Well, I mean, the UK, an interesting example. There was a committee, a high-level committee, working in the UK under a man called Henry Dimbleby, who was the son of David Dimbleby. And to look at our whole food policy. And he came up with 2 two-phase reports, the last of which was published earlier this year. And he had a lot of very good things in those reports, which would have been along the lines of more regulation and higher standards for food, etc. Now, I mean, that ran into then the populist instincts of the Boris Johnson government. But even Johnson, and I've never been known to defend Boris Johnson on anything, I didn't like him, but at least he had some reasonable ideas on food. Partly because he realised after he got sick with COVID that one of the problems he had was that he was too overweight. But this current government, the Truss government, has rolled back entirely on a number of those things. And not to mention your second point about their positioning on climate issues. So, I don't know, it's something that the citizens should be fighting against, I think. And maybe hope that the incoming, hopefully there will be an incoming government which will not be conservative. That it might have a different policy on these things.
You're more optimistic than I am.
Well, I mean, I think societies are going to have to face up to this question of food quality and what's in the interest of society in terms of, you know, trying to make sure that people are eating better. It's not just a matter of what you eat. I mean, there's a whole, it's also exercise, it's about all sorts of things. But if we're to deal with this problem, it's going to have to be a broad-based approach to improving things.
Thank you.
Could I just say one thing? You spoke about breastfeeding and the importance of it. I have a daughter-in-law who is a dietitian, and the 2 little boys and a girl. The youngest, the baby, will be a year old next week, and the little boy is 4, the oldest one. And already she's been told by the nursery school teacher that he thinks like a 6 to 7 year old, and he's only 4. He's absolutely brilliant, and he tells his dad, Dad, when reading stories, I want to know about the moon and the stars. I want to know about the body as the latest one. He's just so far ahead of himself, and his mother is very strict about sugar, no sugars. She'll only have a certain amount, and very strict on the diet in every way. They don't eat potatoes, by the way. They're not obese. He's got so much energy you wouldn't believe. And the 3 children are the same. They're absolutely brilliant. And I'm so thrilled with them, you know.
But it's actually so sad. I mean, I rear children and I work in health. And when I see undernourished children in Cork, you know, I can see it. I can see it in the kids. I know what they're eating, and it's just so sad. Because it's really difficult. And like you were talking about the buy one get one free, the absolute flood of sugar, which is so addictive. I mean, rats will prefer, they'll take sugar above cocaine in experiments. So it's just sad.
Well, I mean,
you know, it's a tragedy, isn't it?
At some level of education.
It is, yeah.
Complete attitude towards
And the thing is, as a mother, I mean, I love health, but I mean, I have a son who's a disgrace. Does he hardly ever eats a vegetable? You know, so there's this massive culture of fast food, of, you know, tasty. I mean, there are food engineers, salt, fat, and sugar. We get the balance right, and it's addictive. So, like, it is about education, but it's a bit more complex than that to it. You know, the culture has to change, and it's really, really difficult and challenging. Fair dues to your grandchildren. It's fantastic to have them like that, but the culture is so powerful. You know, it's huge.
And the reality is that, you know, poorer people are eating poorer diets.
And it's cheap. It's so cheap.
Exactly. These low quality calories are cheaper. I mean, that's the reality.
Yeah.
That, you know, people are going to have to, I don't know, where to go. And maybe it also comes back maybe to even cooking skills.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
I mean, Doreen Allen is so vociferous on you know, teaching people.
Meat and butter.
I mean,
everything.
You do know that Tom's son is a chef.
Oh, lovely.
Tom, just one question. When Gordon Conway talks about democracy, is it?
Yeah.
Are we talking about democracy in places like Africa? How are we talking about democracy in China?
No, No, I mean, I suppose the general point is that, I mean, his basic point was that if you have democratic systems, if you've got a free press, you're less likely to have famine. I mean, that's the simple point that's been made. I mean, in fairness to China, China's development, their record in lifting literally tens of millions of people out of poverty over a long period of time was second to none.
Yes, absolutely.
But there was this huge famine in late 50s, which was entirely man-made by crazy policies. And that's why I said that man was one of the great monsters of history.
Tom, you mentioned about the responsibility of governments, in terms of education and in terms of all, it's a multifaceted kind of approach or a holistic approach. But and during your talk, you spoke about countries like sub-Saharan Africa that were quite directly impacted with the Ukrainian war, and you mentioned that two things that will come out of that. One of the things is that these countries will learn to grow their own grow their own crops. But in that kind of situation where they're very underdeveloped and they don't I suppose have a lot of maybe resources, are countries like Ireland, for example, are there initiatives to help these countries? In terms of I think organisations like Concern or School, are there specific initiatives from the more developed countries to help the underdeveloped countries, to kind of empower them or to educate them in terms of, giving themselves as much autonomy in terms of, growing their own crops and
there's lots going on, but the first and basic thing with many of those countries in Africa is, they have to be in charge of their own development strategy. They have to,
empowering them, exactly.
I was involved with a committee at European level a few years ago about, it was called the Task Force on Rural Africa, and that was looking at how Europe as a whole could work more effectively with Africa to improve the African food situation. And that has to start with African governments themselves having their own policies, which should be, policies that actually just need to recognise the importance of developing their own agricultural sector and their rural economies together. That's crucial. Just developing agriculture on its own won't do the trick. But many of them have real capacity problems, so they're going to have to build this up. There's no quick fixes for these problems. But if there are, there's some countries in Africa are doing quite well, and there's others are not doing well. And there's reason for both situations. But Ireland is, in fairness, playing, I think, through its aid policy over many years, has played a very important role there. Ireland works in about 12 African countries, which they're, have well established. They've got multi-annual programs to try to achieve change. They work out how Ireland can make specific contributions, in line with the government's priorities. And in Brussels as well, there's talk about how what they call a Team Europe can work effectively with African countries, so that you'd have some of the European institutions, like the European Commission, having its aid program, but working hand in hand with the member states. So that's what is happening. And there's quite a lot of competition in Africa as well. The Chinese and the Russians are there as well. So Europe is increasingly looking with some considerable political interests how we can get its act together in Africa.
But Tom, I remember in the 1970s, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania
he started, I think pronounced it Umjama policy,
Yeah.
a policy of local people and
Yeah.
more subsidiarity. But I remember at the time, either the American government or others worked through the governments of Angola, Mozambique and Kenya to crush him. I mean, in words, in effect, the scene that my reading as a teenager at the time was that pressure came from larger countries, the United States, to discourage neighbouring countries to trade with Tanzania. So in effect, here was an example of Africa doing it for itself, as you were talking about here, but it was crushed because of the undermining the vested interests of the in this case the Americans.
Well, I think it was maybe a bit more complex.
Perhaps.
I mean, Julius Nyerere was, of course, hugely admired because he was obviously a very good person. But some of the economic policies at the time actually didn't work terribly well. And this, as you said, he had this policy of Ujamaa, which was really trying to bring together it was called, another version was called villagization, trying to it was very rational to bring together, to focus development on selected villages. But the disadvantage was that it meant that people had to leave their fields where they were cultivating their crops to come to these villages. And this led to a lot of resistance from the people. And that's actually more why it failed than external pressures from other countries.
With regard to, doing something about climate change, does this make any sense that I heard of a charity that was helping to build up the rainforests again in Africa and South America? Good idea? Or
In principle, a good idea, but I think one always has to look beyond the intention of charities to how effective they are.
right?
So, if they were able to, normally charity to be most effective is actually working harmoniously with the local administration. So that would be a first question I'd ask. Were they doing that? In principle, working on to improve the rainforests is of course a good idea. But I don't know beyond that. What the details are.
Well, I suppose I was just thinking about something I heard about an attempt to have a line of forest across Africa
That's
to stop the Sahara from going forward.
Yeah, that's the Great Green Wall, is what it's called. And there's a lot of interest in that, and a lot of international support for it.
Yeah.
And I think in principle it's a good idea. Yeah.
To
stop the encroachment of the Sahara.
Yeah.
The SMA founders have been
That's right.
beating that drum very
Indeed,
hardly.
and you see, they have very significant credibility given their long record in Africa. So if they're supporting it, it's already an indication that it makes sense.
The thought that occurred to me from that was, wouldn't it be great if something similar could happen in Brazil? Now, I presume that election will be bearing in that.
It will have a definite bearing on it. If you have any friends in Brazil, I think, to persuade them not to vote for Bolsonaro would be
I don't.
Is there anybody who hasn't made a comment or an intervention or a question who wants to?
Just a quick question, Tom. Off the top of your head, how many of the families, like you mentioned lots of families, how many of those could be categorically stated to be created by governments or created by humans? I mean, in the sense of the Ukrainian one in the 1930s and the big Chinese one in the 1950s, like they were created by governments straight.
I think most of the famines in the 20th century, the serious ones, were man-made.
Man-made.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, if you look at the two famines in Ethiopia in the 70s, firstly, and in the 80s, there were, of course, climatic conditions which were tending towards famine. But if there had been a responsive government, they wouldn't have been anything like as bad as they were. So I think that's the great. I mean, at the moment, I would have real concerns about the risks in Somalia and in northern Kenya and Ethiopia. I mean, just the sheer fact of the drought that's been there for so long. And in 2011, when I wasn't concerned, we were watching very carefully what was happening over the year in 2011, and particularly paying attention to what was happening to the cattle. And it got to a point in late July, or in July, that I actually went to Mary Robinson to say, look, this is very serious. You were there before in 1992. You made a big difference. Will you come back again in 2000? And we did. We went back, and she again helped greatly to get attention to it. And it so happened that RTE sent the great Jim Fahey, the brother that myself were great friends with, to chronicle that whole episode, and it really made a difference. And Jim, of course, is a force of nature, and he added greatly to the effectiveness of that week that we spent in that period. But yeah, I mean, this time there is a very big risk that unless rains come in the next relatively short time, this situation could get really bad.
Thank you all very much for your insightful and lively contributions and involvement in this conversation. Of course, thanks particularly to Tom for sharing his insights and for sharing all that his experience and involvements have taught him. And all we can say is we are deeply, deeply grateful and deeply appreciative. So in this cycle of the conversations, we started out last week with Archie, and now we have very happily listened to and shared with Tom. The series continues. Next Monday night, Stefan Reynolds, whom some of us have met before, will be here to speak on John of the Cross, Radical Contemplative. And if you've heard Stefan before, you know how deep and rich his knowledge is of the figure he will present, but also of the cultural and religious context in which John of the Cross lived, and of the influences that shaped his life and his thinking. And it certainly will be a rich experience to come and hear Stefan and then engage, as tonight, in a conversation about John of the Cross, Radical Contemplative. And as you go, I'd encourage everyone to bring one of these, or maybe two or three, and give them to a friend or an acquaintance, and encourage people to come and take part in next Monday's conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you.